April 12, 1945. 50 miles from Berlin, Lieutenant General William Simpson stood on the western bank of the Elbe River, watching his Ninth Army establish a bridgehead that nobody expected them to hold. Behind him, 341,000 men waited for the order that would never come. The radio crackled with reports from forward elements who had already crossed, scout teams probing German defenses that seemed to be evaporating like morning fog. Some reconnaissance patrols had driven jeeps to the outskirts of Berlin without encountering serious resistance. Simpson lifted his field telephone and called General Omar Bradley at 12th Army Group headquarters. The request was simple, direct, and devastating in its implications. Permission to advance on Berlin. The German capital lay exposed, barely defended, practically begging to be taken. Bradley relayed the message to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The answer came back within hours. Firm, unequivocal, final, no. Hold at the Elbe. The Ninth Army would advance no further east. 60 miles south, Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army had crossed into Czechoslovakia, racing toward Prague with the same unstoppable momentum that had carried him across France. Patton could taste victory, could see the strategic prize dangling before him. His tanks could reach Prague in days. His commanders assured him Czech resistance fighters were begging for American help, broadcasting desperate appeals through the Prague uprising as German SS units prepared to drown the rebellion in blood. Patton made his own call to Bradley. The answer was identical. No, stop at the prearranged line. Leave Prague to the Soviets. 200 miles to the northwest, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group, with clear orders to drive toward the Baltic ports of Lübeck and Wismar. Not Berlin, not the grand prize that every Allied commander recognized as the ultimate objective. Churchill's orders were explicit. Reach the Danish border before Soviet forces could occupy the Jutland Peninsula. This was acceptable. Berlin was not. Within days, the most controversial decision of World War II would be complete. The Western Allies would halt along the Elbe River, while Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev raced each other through the burning streets of Berlin, paying for every block with thousands of casualties in the most savage urban combat of the European war. The decision would haunt historians for 80 years, spawning endless debates about what might have been if American and British forces had seized the German capital before Stalin's armies arrived. The mathematics of April 1945 told a story that strategic planners understood, but the public never fully grasped. Soviet forces had positioned over 2.5 million troops within 40 miles of Berlin. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front alone numbered 1.3 million men, supported by 37,000 artillery pieces, 6,300 tanks, and 8,400 aircraft. His positions along the Oder River were so close to Berlin that artillery-forward observers could see the Reichstag through binoculars. The Western Allies had achieved remarkable advances since crossing the Rhine in March. American armored spearheads had covered hundreds of miles in weeks, exploiting German defenses that had collapsed on the Western Front while stiffening dramatically against Soviet advances from the east. But those spearheads were exactly that, sharp points at the end of very long supply lines stretching back across devastated France and Belgium. Simpson's Ninth Army held 2 small bridgeheads across the Elbe, not a major lodgment capable of supporting a sustained offensive against a defended capital city. Bradley's estimate was stark and uncompromising. Taking Berlin would cost 100,000 American casualties. The decision Eisenhower made in April 1945 had its foundations in decisions made 14 months earlier, in conference rooms thousands of miles from the battlefront, where political leaders gathered to plan the post-war world before the war itself had ended. The European Advisory Commission had begun work in January 1944, when Allied armies were still preparing for the Normandy invasion. British representatives proposed dividing Germany into zones of occupation based on historical German administrative boundaries. The Americans and British refined these proposals through multiple conferences in Quebec and Malta. At Yalta in February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin finalized the arrangement. Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones. Soviet forces would occupy everything east of the Elbe River. British, American, and French forces would divide the territory to the west. Berlin, located 110 miles deep inside what would become the Soviet zone, would itself be subdivided into 4 sectors of occupation. The agreement was announced publicly. Allied commanders knew the zones before their armies crossed the Rhine. Eisenhower understood that any territory his forces seized east of the Elbe would have to be relinquished to Soviet occupation the moment Germany surrendered. He saw no military justification for spending American lives to capture ground that diplomatic agreements required him to abandon. Churchill saw the situation differently, with the political instincts that had guided him through decades of navigating great power politics. The British Prime Minister understood that Stalin's promises at Yalta regarding free elections in Poland and Eastern Europe were worthless without mechanisms to enforce them. He believed that Western possession of German territory, particularly Berlin, would provide leverage in post-war negotiations with a Soviet Union that showed no inclination to honor agreements once their armies occupied territory. On March 28, 1945, Eisenhower sent a direct cable to Stalin outlining his operational plans. He would halt at the Elbe. He would leave Berlin to Soviet forces. His main effort would drive south toward Bavaria to eliminate rumors of a Nazi national redoubt in the Alps, where fanatical SS units might continue resistance indefinitely. Stalin replied with assurances that Soviet forces considered Berlin a secondary objective, that the main Soviet offensive would come south of the capital. Eisenhower accepted these assurances despite intelligence suggesting they were complete fabrications. Churchill was furious. He believed Eisenhower had exceeded his authority by coordinating directly with Stalin on matters that had profound political implications. The Prime Minister fired off cables to Roosevelt, emphasizing the importance of Western forces capturing as much German territory as possible, particularly Berlin and Prague, before Soviet armies arrived. Political considerations demanded it. Strategic foresight required it. The post-war balance of power depended on it. Roosevelt's response was diplomatic but firm. Eisenhower was the supreme commander. Tactical deployments were military decisions. The president would not override his field commander on operational matters, particularly when that commander had delivered victory after victory since Normandy. Roosevelt died on April 12th, the same day Simpson's forces reached the Elbe. Harry Truman inherited a decision already made, a policy already set. The new president relied on his military advisors, particularly Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, who supported Eisenhower without reservation. The American Joint Chiefs of Staff backed Eisenhower unanimously. They argued that Berlin had become a prestige objective, not a military one. The city had been bombed into ruins by years of Allied air raids. Government ministries had evacuated. Industrial capacity was destroyed. Capturing Berlin would achieve nothing militarily while costing casualties that could be avoided by letting Soviet forces pay the price. American soldiers had fought from North Africa through Sicily, up the Italian peninsula, across France from Normandy and southern beaches, through Belgium and into Germany. They deserved to minimize casualties in the war's final weeks. The British chiefs of staff found themselves outvoted and outmaneuvered. By spring 1945, the Western Allied war effort was overwhelmingly American. The United States provided 3/4 of the ground forces, the vast majority of equipment, weapons, vehicles, and aircraft. British divisions were exhausted, undermanned, operating on reduced strength with replacement pools nearly depleted. Montgomery could advocate for a thrust to Berlin all he wanted. The resources to execute it came from American factories, shipped across the Atlantic in American vessels, delivered to the front in American trucks. General Patton raged against the decision with characteristic fury. He believed American forces could reach Berlin before the Soviets, that German resistance would crumble if defenders knew they were surrendering to the Western Allies rather than Stalin's armies. In a heated exchange with Eisenhower, Patton demanded to know why he couldn't advance. "What in the world for?" Eisenhower asked. Patton's reply was immediate. "You shouldn't have to ask that." Patton understood what many professional soldiers failed to grasp until years later. The war against Germany was ending. The political struggle with the Soviet Union was beginning. Decisions made in April 1945 would determine which side controlled Central Europe for generations. Patton wanted to position American forces as far east as possible, to occupy Prague and Berlin before Soviet forces arrived, to establish Western presence in territories that Stalin coveted. He proposed arming surrendered German units and using them against Soviet forces if necessary. Eisenhower rejected these arguments on multiple grounds. First, the military reality. Taking Berlin would require sustained urban combat against defenders who had fortified every block. The experience at Aachen demonstrated how costly city fighting could be, even against demoralized defenders. Berlin was larger than Aachen by orders of magnitude, defended by SS fanatics and Hitler Youth battalions indoctrinated to fight to death. Bradley's estimate of 100,000 casualties was conservative, possibly optimistic. Second, the logistical challenge. Simpson's bridgeheads across the Elbe were small, vulnerable, maintained by forces at the end of supply lines stretched thin. Mounting a major offensive required concentrating forces, stockpiling ammunition, establishing fuel dumps, organizing medical facilities for mass casualties. This would take weeks, during which Soviet forces already positioned on Berlin's doorstep would complete their encirclement. Third, the political agreement. The occupation zones were decided. Berlin was in the Soviet sector. Even if American forces captured the city, they would withdraw to the agreed boundaries the moment Germany surrendered. Eisenhower saw no point in fighting for territory his government had already promised to Stalin. The criticism stung. He was a military commander, not a diplomat. His mission was destroying German armed forces and ending the war as quickly as possible with minimum Allied casualties. The Soviet offensive that began on April 16th demonstrated what Berlin's capture cost. Zhukov's forces attacked the Silo Heights, encountering prepared German defenses manned by troops who knew surrender to the Soviets meant death or Siberian labor camps. The bombardment that preceded the assault fired 1 million artillery shells in a single day, the largest artillery barrage in history. Soviet tanks advanced behind searchlights that blinded German defenders while illuminating targets. German anti-tank guns destroyed hundreds of Soviet armored vehicles in hours. The battle for the Silo Heights lasted 3 days. Soviet forces suffered 70,000 casualties, capturing positions that German defenders held with suicidal determination. Zhukov's forces finally broke through, advancing toward Berlin, while Konev's First Ukrainian Front drove from the south, racing to see which marshal would claim the honor of capturing the Reichstag. The urban combat that followed exceeded even Soviet expectations for brutality. Every building became a fortress, every street a killing ground. German defenders, knowing the war was lost, fought anyway because surrender meant rape, torture, execution at the hands of an enemy bent on revenge for 4 years of barbaric warfare on the Eastern Front. Soviet casualties in the Battle of Berlin exceeded 300,000 killed and wounded. The Germans suffered over 500,000 casualties, including hundreds of thousands of civilians caught in the crossfire or murdered by vengeful Soviet troops who remembered Leningrad, Stalingrad, the burned villages and mass graves their armies had discovered advancing through Soviet territory. The Red Army planted the Soviet flag on the Reichstag on April 30th. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker that same day. The fighting continued until May 2nd, when the Berlin garrison surrendered. American forces watched from the Elbe, 50 miles distant, hearing the artillery thunder, seeing the smoke rising from the burning city. Simpson's troops held their bridgeheads, processing German soldiers who crossed the river to surrender by the thousands. Wehrmacht units were fleeing west, desperate to reach American lines before Soviet forces caught them. German civilians streamed across the Elbe bridges, families pushing carts loaded with possessions, old people carrying children, teenagers in Hitler Youth uniforms throwing away their weapons and claiming they were refugees. The Americans accepted their surrender, processed them through POW camps, and watched the tragedy unfold. In Czechoslovakia, the drama played out with equal frustration. Patton's Third Army had liberated Pilsen on May 6th, welcomed by delirious crowds who threw flowers and kissed American soldiers, celebrating liberation from 6 years of Nazi occupation. Prague lay 60 miles to the east, accessible by good roads through terrain offering minimal defensive advantages. Czech resistance fighters had risen against German occupation on May 5th, broadcasting appeals in English and Russian for Allied assistance. The SS responded with tanks and infantry, preparing to crush the uprising with the same savage efficiency they had demonstrated throughout the occupation. Patton requested permission to advance. The road was open. German resistance was collapsing. Czech civilians were dying. American forces could reach Prague in hours, save thousands of lives, prevent the city's destruction. Eisenhower said no. The demarcation line with Soviet forces had been agreed. Prague was in the Soviet sphere. Let the Red Army liberate the city. Soviet General Alexei Antonov had assured Eisenhower that Soviet forces were already advancing on Prague, that American intervention would cause confusion and possible friendly fire incidents. Antonov was lying. Soviet forces were still regrouping after the Berlin fighting, taking positions for an offensive that wouldn't begin until May 7th. Eisenhower accepted the deception, ordered American forces to halt, and left Prague to the Soviets despite pleas from Czech resistance leaders. The Red Army liberated Prague on May 9th, after most of the fighting was over, after German forces had largely withdrawn or surrendered. The political consequences were immediate and permanent. Czechs and Slovaks, who had hoped for Western liberation, found themselves under Soviet occupation instead. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia used Soviet liberation of Prague as propaganda, convincing many citizens that only Moscow would protect them from future German aggression. Within 3 years, communists had seized total control. Czechoslovakia remained a Soviet satellite for 41 years. The strategic arguments for Eisenhower's decision were sound from a purely military perspective. Berlin was a destroyed city with no industrial or military value. The occupation zones were agreed. American forces were already beyond the lines they would ultimately hold. Advancing to Berlin would cost casualties for territory that would be surrendered anyway. The mythical Alpine redoubt, though it proved to be largely fictional, seemed credible in April 1945, based on intelligence reports suggesting Nazi fanatics might continue resistance from mountain fortresses. The political arguments against Eisenhower's decision were equally compelling from a Cold War perspective that didn't exist in April 1945. Soviet occupation of Berlin and Prague gave Stalin control of symbols that carried immense psychological weight. The power that captured Hitler's capital and liberated the Czech capital appeared to have won the war in Europe, regardless of Western contributions from D-Day through the Rhine crossings. Stalin exploited this perception masterfully, presenting the Soviet Union as the primary defeater of fascism, while dismissing Western military efforts. Soviet control of territory from the Elbe to the Oder created facts on the ground that no diplomatic negotiation could reverse. Stalin had promised free elections in Poland at Yalta. He never held them. He had promised to respect sovereignty in Eastern Europe. He installed puppet governments instead. Western protests were futile. Soviet armies occupied the territory. Western armies did not. Physical possession trumped diplomatic agreements. The question that haunted post-war strategists was whether Western capture of Berlin and Prague would have changed Stalin's behavior. The optimistic view suggested that holding German territory east of the agreed occupation zones would have provided leverage in negotiations, bargaining chips to ensure Soviet compliance with Yalta agreements. Churchill believed this fervently, arguing until his death that Eisenhower's decision to halt at the Elbe was the greatest strategic mistake of the war. The pessimistic view, held by Eisenhower and his defenders, argued that no amount of leverage would have modified Stalin's fundamental objectives. The Soviet dictator wanted buffer states protecting Soviet borders. He wanted communist governments in Eastern Europe. He wanted control of resources and populations to rebuild Soviet industry, devastated by 4 years of total war. Giving him Berlin or denying him Prague wouldn't have changed these core goals. Stalin would have found other methods to achieve them, diplomatic agreements notwithstanding. The military realities supported Eisenhower's position. Soviet forces vastly outnumbered Western Allied armies in the Berlin sector. The Red Army had positioned 2.5 million troops specifically to capture the German capital. American spearheads numbered perhaps 20 divisions covering an enormous front, dealing with pockets of German resistance across hundreds of miles. Concentrating sufficient force for a Berlin offensive would have required weeks, during which Soviet forces would have completed their encirclement anyway. The casualty estimates proved accurate when Soviet forces paid the price. Over 300,000 Soviet casualties to capture a city that Eisenhower considered militarily worthless validated his judgment that American lives shouldn't be spent on prestige objectives. Soviet forces could afford those casualties. Stalin had millions more soldiers available. The American public, after 3.5 years of war, would not have accepted 100,000 casualties to capture a city that would be handed to the Soviets immediately afterward. the counterfactual scenarios are endless and ultimately unprovable. If American forces had captured Berlin, would Stalin have honored occupation zone agreements? Would he have allowed American troops to remain in the Soviet-designated sector? Would he have manufactured incidents to force American withdrawal, perhaps staging false flag attacks to justify Soviet military action? The Berlin blockade of 1948 demonstrated Stalin's willingness to use food and fuel as weapons against Western forces in the city. Would he have been more or less aggressive if American troops had captured Berlin rather than Soviet forces? If Patton had liberated Prague, would Czechoslovakia have avoided communist takeover? The presence of American liberators might have strengthened democratic forces, weakened communist propaganda about Soviet saviors. But American forces withdrew from Czechoslovakia in December 1945, according to agreements with the Soviet Union. Would that withdrawal have been different if Americans had liberated Prague? Would the Czech people have resisted communist pressure more effectively with memories of American liberation rather than Soviet? The information available to Eisenhower in April 1945 didn't include knowledge of what Stalin would do in the next 3 years. The Cold War hadn't started. The Iron Curtain hadn't descended. Western intelligence didn't fully appreciate the extent of Soviet espionage networks or the sophistication of communist infiltration in Western European governments. The possibility that wartime alliance with the Soviet Union might transform into decades of geopolitical conflict seemed remote to many American strategists focused on defeating Japan and bringing millions of soldiers home. Eisenhower's defenders argue that he made the correct military decision based on information available and his understanding of his mission. His critics argue that supreme commanders must consider political implications, that purely military decisions at the strategic level are impossible because military actions have political consequences. The debate continues because both positions have merit, depending on whether one prioritizes minimizing casualties in a war nearly won or maximizing political leverage for conflicts not yet begun. The personal factor cannot be ignored. Eisenhower was supremely talented at coalition warfare, maintaining alliance unity despite enormous pressures. His relationship with Montgomery was often tense, complicated by British sensitivity about declining power and American frustration with Montgomery's cautious tactics. His relationship with Churchill involved navigating between military necessity and political vision. His relationship with Soviet commanders required maintaining cooperation while managing mutual suspicion. Racing the Soviets to Berlin would have introduced competition into an alliance already showing signs of strain. Eisenhower worried about friendly fire incidents, about American and Soviet forces meeting unexpectedly in confused combat that could escalate into accidental war. He wanted clear demarcation lines, formal meetings between commanders, controlled transitions from combat to occupation. Racing for political objectives would have undermined these careful arrangements, potentially causing exactly the kind of incidents he sought to avoid. The German surrender that came on May 8, 1945, ended the war in Europe on terms favorable to the Western Allies in every way except political positioning. German forces had been destroyed. The Nazi regime had been obliterated. Hitler was dead. The concentration camps were liberated. Millions of Allied prisoners were freed. Europe was saved from fascist tyranny. These achievements were enormous, historic, transformative. But the peace that followed was not the peace Allied soldiers had fought for. Eastern Europe disappeared behind Soviet occupation, emerging decades later with populations traumatized by communist oppression. Germany was divided into hostile states separated by barriers, minefields, armed guards authorized to shoot citizens trying to escape. Berlin became a divided city, an island of Western presence, inside Soviet territory, a flashpoint for crisis after crisis that brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. The soldiers who stopped at the Elbe carried the frustration for the rest of their lives. They had won the war. They had defeated the Wehrmacht. They had proven that American industrial might combined with individual soldier initiative could overcome any military force on Earth. And they had stopped 50 miles from Berlin because diplomatic agreements made in conference rooms far from the battlefield determined that Soviet forces would plant their flag on the Reichstag. Simpson later said he believed his Ninth Army could have taken Berlin with minimal casualties if permitted to advance. Scout patrols had reported German defenses crumbling, Wehrmacht units actively seeking opportunities to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. The Ninth Army included veteran divisions that had fought from Normandy through the Siegfried Line, experienced in urban combat, well supplied, led by commanders who understood combined arms warfare. They would never know if they could have succeeded because they never received the order to try. Patton's frustration was more vocal and lasted longer. He believed politicians had betrayed military victory with diplomatic cowardice. That fear of Soviet sensitivity had prevented the West from claiming prizes that American soldiers had earned through blood and sacrifice. In the months after Germany's surrender, Patton advocated increasingly extreme positions, suggesting that Allied forces should rearm German units and prepare for war against the Soviet Union. His statements became so controversial that Eisenhower relieved him of command, assigning him to a headquarters position where his strategic vision couldn't influence policy. Churchill spent the rest of his life arguing that Eisenhower's decision was a catastrophic mistake that condemned Eastern Europe to Soviet tyranny. In his memoirs and speeches, the former prime minister emphasized that Western forces could have positioned themselves far more favorably if political considerations had received proper weight in military planning. He blamed American naivete about Soviet intentions, arguing that Roosevelt's trust in Stalin had blinded American strategists to obvious warning signs that the wartime alliance would not survive peace. Eisenhower never wavered in defending his decision publicly. In his 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, he argued that purely military considerations justified halting at the Elbe, that Berlin was not worth American casualties, that occupation zone agreements made capture of Soviet-designated territory pointless regardless of political leverage arguments. But in private conversations in the 1950s, after the Cold War had fully developed, Eisenhower occasionally suggested that perhaps political considerations should have carried more weight, that perhaps Churchill's warnings about Soviet intentions deserved more attention. The lesson military strategists drew from the Berlin decision-shaped Cold War, thinking about the relationship between military operations and political objectives. Future operations in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts reflected constant tension between commanders who wanted freedom to pursue military victory and political leaders who insisted on limitations based on diplomatic considerations. The question of whether military commanders should operate within purely military parameters or consider broader political implications became central to strategic thinking. For the soldiers who fought the war, the decision remained incomprehensible decades later. They had crossed the Atlantic, stormed Normandy beaches, fought through hedgerows, survived the Battle of the Bulge, breached the Siegfried Line, crossed the Rhine, and advanced to within sight of Berlin. And they had stopped because men in Washington and London decided that the war's end should be managed through diplomatic agreements rather than battlefield victories. The frustration never fully healed. The counterfactual history is tempting. American forces capture Berlin in late April. Patton liberates Prague in early May. Western armies occupy territory deep inside Soviet-designated zones. Stalin protests but accepts fait accompli. Occupation negotiations proceed with Western leverage enhanced. Poland receives genuine free elections. Eastern Europe avoids 4 decades of communist tyranny. The Berlin Wall never gets built. The Cold War takes a fundamentally different trajectory. But this alternative history requires assumptions that may be fantasy. Would Stalin have accepted Western occupation of Berlin peacefully? Would he have honored agreements any more faithfully if Western forces held political leverage? Would American public opinion have supported maintaining large armies in Europe beyond immediate post-war occupation duties? Would American casualties in Berlin and Prague have numbered 100,000, as Bradley estimated, more or miraculously less? Would Stalin have found other ways to achieve his political objectives, regardless of who captured German cities? History records what happened, not what might have been. Western forces stopped at the Elbe. Soviet forces captured Berlin at horrific cost. Czechoslovakia fell behind the Iron Curtain. Germany was divided for 45 years. The Cold War dominated international politics for nearly half a century. Whether different tactical decisions in April 1945 would have fundamentally altered these outcomes remains one of history's great unanswerable questions. What remains indisputable is that Eisenhower made the decision based on military logic, diplomatic agreements, and his understanding of his mission. He sought to minimize casualties, maintain alliance unity, and end the war as quickly as possible. He succeeded in those objectives. Whether he should have pursued different objectives, whether political considerations should have overridden military logic, whether the post-war order would have been more favorable if American forces had captured Berlin and Prague. These questions have occupied historians for 80 years and will continue generating debate as long as scholars study World War II's conclusion. The soldiers who stopped at the Elbe never forgot that they could have gone further. The statesman who ordered them to stop never doubted that his decision was correct. The British Prime Minister who opposed the decision never stopped believing it was catastrophically wrong. The Soviet dictator who benefited from the decision never acknowledged that Western restraint had given him control of Eastern Europe. The history of World War II's end is incomplete without understanding this decision and the enormous consequences that flowed from it, consequences that shaped the world for generations and continue influencing international politics today. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's most controversial decisions fascinating, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more detailed historical analysis. We explore the complex decisions that shaped our world, examining not just what happened, but why leaders made the choices they did, and how those choices continue affecting us decades later. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next story from history's most pivotal moments.